The purpose of this talk is to give college students like yourself an overview of HCI, human-computer interaction, as a field, and design just broadly as a field, and then really talk a lot about showing what kind of jobs you can get with an HCI and design degree. Many students and alumni wish they had heard at this talk at the very beginning of college, because all of this takes a lot of time to prepare. So this is why COGS 1 is the perfect class to give this talk in. I give this talk in my other classes too, but I think the earlier we can reach students to think about these sorts of issues, the more effective it'll be. Big warning here, we're going to go through a lot of slides. There's a lot of dense text. This is not a good example of visual design or slide design. So this is very ironic because this is supposed to be an HCI and design talk, and it's horribly designed, as you can see. But it's because I want to put a lot of content in here so that really you can use these slides as a reference guide. And we can post the slides on the course website, or if you just search for my website and stuff, people find this talk. You can also just come talk to me afterwards. Okay, so we have actually a lot of HCI and design faculty and research staff at UCSD across many departments. So this is a website just listing a lot of our faculty and researchers. And CogSci has a lot of the HCI and design faculty, but we have faculty spanning many departments and divisions here, and also dozens of students. About 30 grad students, 60 undergrads, just all in different areas and such. Many of them obviously in cognitive science. So HCI design is a really, really diverse and interdisciplinary field. So everyone you're going to meet will have their own take on it, which I think is a cool thing. So if you just ask, everybody you ask about HCI design, they're going to have somewhat of a different definition, but you should definitely just ask people what they mean by the field. So I'm going to try to cover the very basics that I think most people would probably agree on. So a bit of just terminology. So the term HCI is often used in academia and very academic or research settings. If you look in industry or corporate settings, it's often called something called UX, or user experience. The X stands for, I guess, the X in experience. It's usually called UX design or just design in general. You'll often see these terms kind of used interchangeably. So just think about this while we're going through the talk. Okay, so I think a good way to introduce what the field is to just kind of walk through what you might learn in a typical class. So this is what you might learn in a typical introductory, HCI 101 sort of class. We have several of these that we teach in the department, and we all follow pretty much the same sort of process. So here is a really, really high-level overview of the process of doing HCI and design. So I'm just going to go through these one by one, starting from the top down to the bottom. So in the very beginning, you do what's called user research. You talk to potential users, you sketch out storyboards, you sketch out user personas. You're really trying to get at the question of what do people really need or want, right? What are people's real needs are. And then we start thinking about what should we consider starting to build as our prototypes, whether we're building an app or building a service or building some kind of a visual thing or an animation or thing. And then we move on to some kind of prototyping. So we prototype on paper on using these digital tools to answer how should we start to build it. And then we move on to more interactive prototypes. So thinking about, how should it look and feel? How should this service or this tool or this thing we're building look and feel? And then we do some kind of empirical science, right? We do user testing, we do deploy it online, we collect data. We really try to measure how well it works for people and then adjust and iterate. And then the final thing is you end up with some kind of, in many of our courses, we build a web application, we build kind of a website, we build a simple mobile app. Those are just the kind of medium that we typically do in kind of a computational field. But you can imagine if you're in mechanical engineering, your final thing is some kind of 3D printed design or a robot, or if you're in visual arts, it's some kind of installation or some kind of interactive piece, right? It's just, a lot of the stuff we do is, as computational people, we're building an app, right? We're basically building things that you run on your phone or you're visiting your web browser that you're browsing. Okay, so here's what you kind of do. Here's the kind of activities that you typically do. I'm just kind of giving you really high-level overview. So in the first phase, you basically observe potential users in their natural habitat. You do interviews, you do observations, you might do surveys. This is very anthropological, right? So this is very much doing kind of anthropology, doing kind of observational sort of studies. And this is a quote that was from the startup world, right? So there was this motto called "Make something people want," which is a common quote that people use when they're thinking about how do you develop startup or product ideas. And while that's good, someone actually scratched it out and instead of want, they said need, right? And which is really this important distinction, right? That you can ask people what they want, but really by observing people and how they work and how they do things, you actually get to see what they really need instead of just what they say they want, right? Like we all say we want some things, but we might actually need something different. The next step is that you can do prototypes, oftentimes on paper. You can make these what's called low fidelity prototypes. Here's some example here. There's some videos. You can just go to the slides when we post them. But like you can basically make cutouts of these user interfaces. This is kind of like a Gmail-like app, right? You kind of stare at this. It's kind of like an email app. You can imagine making these user interfaces on paper, moving them around, testing them with people. It's a very lightweight way to just get feedback on ideas, right? Without even writing any code or using any computer tools. This is a really kind of classic idea. And then you might use computer tools, right? You might use something like Adobe Illustrator, or if you're using more UI tools, there are tools like Sketch or Figma or Adobe XD. These kind of vector drawing tools for making these digital prototypes. This is the first step, and then you might actually write some code. Start writing some HTML or CSS code to start making it look better on a web page. And then you might do some experimental science, right? You get real people, you bring them to your lab, you do this kind of, very typical sort of kind of behavioral science studies. You have them use something on the computer and the app, you watch them, you measure things, or you can deploy online, right? Because these things are often online. You can deploy online, you can collect data and do data analysis on them. So very famously, this is really, really old by now, but this is the 2008 President Obama's first campaign. This was widely known for being the first campaign to really make use of online experimentation of user interfaces. So this is a typical kind of campaign page, right? Basically a landing page from the home page. And then there's basically just a call to action there. They just want you to put your email address in and just sign up so that you can receive their newsletters and basically solicit donations, right? So they basically had various design ideas for what picture do we put here, and then what buttons do we put, right? What should we say here to get people to sign up, right? So how do we design this? So they would just launch various experiments where they would launch different versions of the site to maybe different people and then show different variations. And then because it's all online, they can measure all the data about how many people go to the page, how often they stay on the page, how many people actually end up clicking and setting their email address and stuff. So very famously, they iterated a bunch and they ended up with this successful design, which is actually the logo is the slogan also they experimented with, right? So they experiment with slogan changes, with picture changes, and with the button changes. So these sorts of changes were reportedly found to have, to just bring in, this news story was, $60 million and more in campaign donations as they were testing this. So this stuff is so much taken for granted today, right? Like everything you're using now, like if you're going on Amazon to shop, basically every website you're using is constantly running user interface experiments on all of us constantly, which is why it's kind of annoying sometimes, right? Because you're going to a website and something looks different. It's because you're part of an experiment, and it's, we can talk about all this offline, but we're all part of online experiments all the time, and we're not really aware of it, which raises many ethical issues, but that's just what we do nowadays in 2019, and we're using all these apps online. But this is happening all the time. And then finally, you're building something to ship. So Steve Jobs famously said, real artists ship, which is kind of a quote that's kind of alluded to this idea that, yes, you could be the best designer, the best artist in the world. You could, make these things that look awesome and are just amazing. But if you're not actually shipping things that actually go in the world, then it doesn't really matter, right? Because no one actually sees what you do. So products are never done, right? They're just, they're just shipped and released.